Shabbos, Shabbos, Freude. Bei Shabbos, 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 Freude. Heilige Shabbos, leichtige Shabbos. Bei Shabbos, 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 Freude. Bei Shabbos, 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 Freude. Bei heilige Shabbos.
I could listen to that for a while. That's Yoeli Weiss singing Shabbos. A good Shabbos, a good Hodesh. It's the second day of Rosh Hodesh. We're welcoming the month of Adar Beis, the second Adar, which contains Purim, and we're awaiting Shabbos. This is a time of joy, big joy, time to be besimcha. Let's light up the darkness. Who is with us as we gather to do some very interesting learning on a Friday afternoon? Yehudit. Shabbat Shalom, Nina, Sal, and everyone wishing you all a restful and rejuvenating Shabbos. Stephen in New Hampshire, Renee in Indiana, Bill in mid-Missouri, PK in Colorado, Gordo in Scotland, our Friday man, Nancy in North Carolina, Tom in Pennsylvania, James in Indianapolis, Clarice says Shabbat Shalom, Rick in, it skipped on me, where'd it go? Rick in the Chicago area, James in Indianapolis, Chaim says a good Shabbos. Tom, good dinner last night with Nina's mom? Oh yeah, it was very good. We had shawarma and pargiot at a place called Taim that we really love. If you're ever in LA and you want some amazing Israeli food, hit Taim. Is my face totally washed out? Back up the light a little. Okay. One there? That's fine. And who else is with us? Clarice from Mexico City. Guy in Dayton. Chaim says, good Shabbos. Everybody is with us. And over on the YouTube side, Marjorie in Georgia. I mean, that light is just too much with the... Hold on a second. That's going to be better, right? Okay. Days are getting brighter. Sun is coming across higher. We have a skylight here in the office, so maybe not, won't be so washed out. Okay. Let's get into it. Another prayer for peace. The peace of Yerushalayim, the peace of Jerusalem, the peace of Ukraine, peace wherever people are in conflict. May we be blessed with peace. And may Mashiach come today and bless the entire world with peace. We say Amen. All right. We are today on page 23 here in Tractate Chagigah, which means the Siyum is 4 days away. This tractate ends on page 27. So we're really close now. And today, you know, we're continuing the laws of the stringencies of various foods, right? And basically in this chapter 3, Mishna number 1, we're discussing how the sages adopted stringencies to protect foods of various levels of holiness. Sort of at the bottom is just non-sacred food, which even today we wash our hands when we eat non-sacred food with bread, meaning that it's a meal. And then comes and then we have this tricky place where we put this in the level of holiness. Non-sacred food prepared according to the standards of sacrificial foods, which the Chaverim, the very, very pious people in ancient times, would be sure that no matter what they ate, they were in a state of ritual purity. Then you have the second tithe, consecrated food to be eaten when you're in Jerusalem, terumah, which is food set aside that only priests can eat, and then the sacrificial foods themselves, which require the highest guarantee that the person eating it, the vessels that are handling it, are all in a state of absolute ritual purity, guaranteed ritual purity. I mean, either it's pure or it's not, but they want to guarantee that the person and the vessels carrying that food would be in a state of ritual purity. And so now we're sort of working with what decrees the sages would issue to ensure that level of certainty that the food was in a state of tahara, ritual purity. And today we get quite practical with it and how they adopt these policies and when they do and when they don't. So first, let's sort of set up the case and then how the sages handle it. So the Mishnah teaches one who carries an object trodden by a zav, right? So something that was walked over by a zav, which is a man with gonorrhea, who imparts a pretty high level of ritual impurity. Such a person who's carrying this object, right, that can impart, the point of that, it received its ritual impurity, its terumah, from this man who had certain kinds of seminal emissions, is that object can in turn transmit terumah to something else. So one who carries an object that was trodden in this way may carry terumah at the same time. So in other words, there's a man walking and he's got in one hand an object which is guaranteed tameh, ritually impure, and with a level of terumah that it can transmit that terumah if it comes into contact with something else. And in this hand, he can carry a vessel containing terumah, consecrated food that only a priest can eat and which must be guaranteed to be in a state of ritual purity. So the terumah is not going to flow through his body from this object that's tameh to the terumah over here. It's not going to make him tameh and therefore that tameh. But if they came together, then the ritual impurity would be transmitted. They're saying they're not worried about that. This guy can be trusted to keep the terumah apart from the terumah. Right? You're learning terms if they weren't familiar to you before. Okay, but this object that is tameh, meaning it has terumah, ritual impurity, can be carried by the same person who's carrying terumah, food set aside, consecrated, that only priests can eat. But if in this hand he's carrying sacrificial foods, right? Foods of the highest level, where the highest level of purity must be guaranteed, meaning it's either an animal or flour or wine or oil that is going to be used as a sacrifice in the temple. All of this presumes that the holy temple is standing. Then it does not work. A person is not allowed to carry a tameh object and sacrificial foods. He is allowed to carry a tameh object and terumah. Why the difference? Okay. One who carries an object trodden by a zav may carry terumah at the same time if he is careful that neither he nor the impure object come into contact with the terumah itself. But this may not be done with sacrificial food. And the Gemara asks concerning sacrificial food, what is the reason he may not carry it? As long as contact with the food is prevented, why should he not carry sacrificial food as well? And the Gemara answers, this enactment was made due to an incident. And this is key. This enactment was made due to an incident that occurred, a specific circumstance that happened and they responded to with a new policy. As Rav Yehuda said, that Shmuel said, there was once an incident involving someone who was transferring a barrel of sacrificial wine from one place to another. Now we're at the top of 23a. And the strap of his sandal, which had been rendered ritually impure by being trodden by a zav, broke off, and he picked up the strap and placed it on top of the mouth of the barrel without thinking about it. And it fell into the airspace of the barrel, thereby rendering the entire barrel impure. Right? So this barrel of wine, it wasn't just wine. It was wine that had been set aside to be used as sacrificial wine. That wine is going to cost a lot more than regular wine, even though the wine itself is the same, to safeguard its tahara, to safeguard its ritual purity. A lot of time and effort and cost would be associated with making sure that it was kept in that state of ritual purity, because if it became tameh, it could no longer be used for the sacrifice, and it would be a shame. Okay, so in this case, this guy who was transporting sacrificial wine, and he had a sandal that for sure was tameh, and the sandal strap came into contact. It didn't even go into the wine itself, but in the airspace of the barrel, it had rendered all the wine impure. At that time, the sages said and issued a permanent decree that one who carries an object that is impure by having been trodden by a zav may carry terumah at the same time, but not sacrificial food. And the Gemara asks, if so, if they prohibited doing so due to the incident, they should have made the same decree with regard to terumah also, because if the same incident would occur with terumah, it would defile the terumah as well. And the Gemara answers, in accordance with whose opinion is this stated? It is that of Rabbi Hananiah ben Akavia, who said concerning a similar issue, they prohibited it only in the Jordan River and only in a boat in a situation similar to the incident that occurred, which triggered the enactment. In his opinion, whenever the sages enacted a decree prohibiting something due to a particular incident, they did not extend the prohibition to related cases, but only to the same set of circumstances that pertained to that specific incident. Very important principle right here. And I'm reminded right back to first year of law school. I was a lawyer briefly before I went to film school. And I remember, several law professors in different subjects in law school all saying that same phrase. Tough cases make bad law, right? Because you see a tough case meaning that the law is such that the result is going to feel inequitable, right? Because the law, the way that it stands now, it doesn't protect, a certain person in this kind of a situation, and our heart goes out to that person. And so the typical reaction is, let's pass a new law so that this doesn't happen again. But then they make an overreaching law that would solve the inequity of this particular case, but would create all kinds of unintended consequences and inequitable results in all kinds of other cases. And that's why we have so many politicians drafting so many laws every year that if you actually looked at all the laws that have ever been passed in America, it's like such an extraordinary number of laws. It's like who could ever function or live? So you have to be very careful, say the sages, that when you've got one of these tough situations and you're going to issue a decree to respond to it so that in the future we don't have that same difficulty, that you don't overreach and really you just legislate for the same situation and not all of the similar or related situations. And the Gemara presents the background to Rabbi Hananiah ben Akavia's statement. What is that enactment that Rabbi Hananiah ben Akavia was referring to? So here we're saying there was this incident in which a barrel of sacrificial wine became impure because a sandal that had the terumah imparted by the treading of a zav became impure and it was ruined. And so they said, okay, you can't carry an impure object and sacrificial foods, but we're not going to extend that ban, saying you can't carry an impure object and other foods of sort of lesser sanctity, even terumah, which is a very high level of sanctity, but just not as much as sacrificial foods. And where did they get the principle that they only apply these kinds of decrees that are in response to an incident to circumstances like the same as the incident or very similar to the incident and not beyond that? Where do we learn that? So as it is taught in a Baraisa, a person may not carry the water of purification and the ashes of purification and transport them across the Jordan River, and this is if he is on a boat. Right? So what are they talking about? So the waters of purification, when the temple was standing, if a person came into contact with a corpse, or some other situations, but basically when you come into contact with a corpse, so you derive the highest, you would sort of catch, or it would be imparted to you the highest level of ritual impurity, corpse terumah. And so what does that require? We talked about it a bunch of times. Now you go through a 7-day purification process, where on the 3rd and 7th days you receive the waters of sprinkling, which is just pure water mixed with the ashes of the red heifer. You sprinkled on that on the 3rd and 7th days of your purification process. Then you immerse in a mikveh, and then you wait for nightfall, and then you're purified again and you can enter the temple. While that corpse terumah is on you, or any terumah, you can't enter the holy temple. All right? So there was this incident where waters of purification and ashes of the red heifer were being transported across the Jordan River. And so because of something that happened, they said, we're not going to allow you to take waters of purification and or ashes of the red heifer across the Jordan River in a boat. Nor may he float them across the river, nor may he ford the river riding on an animal or on his friend and carrying the water of ashes of purification, unless his feet are touching the ground as he fords the river. If it's very shallow, you can walk across. Any other thing, you're not going to be allowed to get in the river or on a boat in the river or on an animal fording the river or riding on a person who's fording the river. Not going to work. And this decree applies both to the Jordan and other rivers. And Rabbi Hanani ben Akavia says the sages prohibited these acts only in the Jordan River, not other rivers, and only if he transports them in a boat, and in circumstances exactly like those of the incident that occurred. He would limit this decree about transporting across the Jordan River to you cannot take the ashes of purification, the water purification or the ashes of the red heifer across the Jordan River in a boat. Not all these other extra decrees that you can't walk across, that you can't ford unless your feet are on the ground, that you can't do it on your friend's back or on an animal or float them across. He would not create an enactment against those activities that would be permitted, according to Hanani ben Akavia, only because the incident occurred when these things were being transported across the Jordan River in a boat, so you can't transport those things across the Jordan River in a boat. And the Gemara inquires, what was the incident that occurred? And Rav Yehuda said that Rav said, there was an incident involving a person who was transferring water purification and ashes of purification in the Jordan, and he was on a boat, and an olive bulk from a corpse was discovered stuck in the floor of the boat, over which the water purification had passed, right? This is a piece of a corpse, and the water purification was just above it, didn't come into contact with it, but corpse terumah sort of lifts upward to anything that passes in the airspace above it. This is why a Kohen, a priest, even today, doesn't enter a cemetery unless it's to bury their parent, because if you walk over a grave, you would become tameh. So same idea, the waters of purification were ruined because they had become tameh by going over. It's amazing because the waters of purification solve corpse terumah, but they themselves would be ruined, disqualified by passing over a piece of a corpse. And it was enough of a corpse, right? It was more than the minimum volume. So where am I? There was an incident involving a person who was transferring water purification and ashes of purification in the Jordan River, and he was on a boat, and an olive bulk from a corpse was discovered stuck in the floor of the boat, over which the water of purification had passed, thereby rendering them impure and invalid. And at that time, the sages said, a person may not carry water of purification and ashes of purification and transport them across the Jordan, and this is on a boat. Just as in that case, Rabbi Hanani ben Akavia stated that the decree was limited to the specific circumstances of the original incident. And here too, he would say that since the original incident involved sacrificial food, the person carrying a sandal that was impure, and sacrificial foods, a barrel of sacrificial wine, so that's going to be prohibited in the future. You can't carry a tameh object and sacrificial foods, but we're not going to extend that ban to a person carrying an impure object and terumah or some other lesser sacred thing. And they will not extend that decree against carrying an impure object and terumah. Now, several dilemmas were raised before the scholars. It is clear that this law, like the incident itself, applies to an object that has actually contracted ritual impurity by being trodden by a zav, such as an impure sandal. But if it is a pure sandal, what is the law? Are we going to? Did they decree against carrying a sandal, which you don't know if it's pure or impure, and sacrificial food because it might be impure? You would think we would not do that. We're only saying you cannot carry a known impure sandal with a high degree of impurity of being trodden by a zav and sacrificial food. But right, the question is asked. But if it is a pure sandal, what is the law? Is the decree so far-reaching as to include a prohibition against carrying even a pure sandal together with the sacrificial food? Similarly, the law certainly applies to an open barrel, where there is a danger that the sandal may enter the airspace of the barrel, as in the original incident. But if it was a closed barrel, where there is no such danger, what is the law? Could he carry an impure sandal and a barrel of wine that is sealed so that there's no danger that the impure sandal will enter the airspace of the barrel? Another question, if someone transgressed this decree and carried an impure sandal together with sacrificial food, what is the law? Did the sages decree that the sacrificial food would automatically become defiled because their decree was transgressed or not? In other words, well, he carried an impure sandal and barrel of sacrificial wine. They did not come into contact with each other, but he did violate the sages' decree. Does that then mean that the wine is defiled as to ensure that the other people don't transgress the decree? Or is it a priori, it's prohibited, but now that it happened and did not come into contact with each other, we'll let it go and not incur, cause the owner of the wine to incur the financial loss that it's ruined? And the Gemara presents a conclusion for the last dilemma. Rabbi Illah said, if one transgressed and carried sacrificial food together with an impure sandal, it is indeed rendered impure, right, to give strength to the sage's decree, even though there was no contact between the impure sandal and the wine. Rabbi Zera said, if he transgressed and carried sacrificial food in this manner, it is still pure. That's where we leave that question. And the Mishna states, vessels that were fashioned and completed in purity require immersion for sacrificial food, but not for terumah. And the Gemara asks, who completed the work of these vessels? Right, so a vessel does not become susceptible to impurity until it is completed. It cannot become impure until it is a vessel. So during its manufacture, it can't become impure until it's a completed vessel. So what they're talking about here is, okay, well, let's say that a chaver, right, one of these people who is pious and ensures that he's only coming into contact with pure objects, fabricates the vessel, so for sure he and his equipment and everything around was pure, and then they finish the vessel. So there's no chance that this brand new vessel in the possession of somebody who's meticulous about matters of ritual purity, it never had a chance to become impure. So it's ready to go to be used to transport terumah. But for sacrificial foods, no, because they need to guarantee that highest level of purity and sanctity. So even though it was completed in a state of guaranteed purity, it's still going to require immersion before it can be used for sacrificial foods. Right, so vessels that were fashioned and completed in purity require immersion for sacrificial food, but not for terumah. The Gemara asks, who completed the work of these vessels? If we say that it was a chaver, one who was meticulous about the laws of ritual purity, if we say it was a chaver who completed them, why should they require immersion, given that he is meticulous about the laws of purity? Rather, it must mean that an am ha'aretz, common person, completed them. But can one call these vessels completed in purity? The very touch of an am ha'aretz renders them impure. Another decree of the sages, because since you can't trust that an am ha'aretz, if he became impure, would make sure to render himself pure before coming into contact with these things. They just said the touch of an am ha'aretz renders such vessels impure. And Rabbi Bar Shaila said that Rav Matana said that Shmuel said, actually, the Mishnah is dealing with vessels that a chaver completed, and the sages declared them impure for sacrificial foods due to the concern that the spittle of an am ha'aretz might have fallen on them, which would render them impure if he were a zav. And the Gemara asks, when did this hypothetical spittle fall on the vessel? If we say that it was before he completed the vessel, in that case, it is not yet a vessel and therefore cannot contract impurity at that stage at all. Rather, it must have sprayed onto the vessel after he completed it. But at that point, since he is a chaver, he is careful about it. He would ensure that no spittle would fall on it, so there is no danger that it might have become defiled. And the Gemara responds, actually, you must explain that the spittle fell before he completed it, when the chaver was not yet guarding it against impurity, and the sages were concerned that perhaps at the moment when he completed the vessel, the spittle was still moist and thus still capable of defiling the finished vessel. For the continued presence of the spittle on the vessel might have escaped the attention of the chaver, who is the craftsman. And the Gemara comments, the Mishna states that the vessel requires immersion, implying immersion, yes, but the setting of the sun after immersion, no. I.e., it is considered pure immediately after immersion in the mikveh, even though generally the purification engendered by immersion does not take effect until sunset. Like I mentioned, that a person who becomes tameh with corpse terumah, right, he has to have that sprinkling on the 3rd and 7th days, then he immerses in the mikveh during the day, and then he has to wait till nighttime for his purification to be complete. But this kind of preemptive immersion, just in case, it's enough just to immerse, and you don't have to wait nightfall to complete the purification. And the Gemara asks, if so, the Mishnah is not in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer. As we learned in a Mishnah in Para 5:4, right? So this is the laws of the red heifer, regarding a tube of reed, which one cut for storing ashes of purification. Rabbi Eliezer says he should immerse it immediately. And Rabbi Yehoshua says he should first render it impure, guarantee that it is tameh, right? He should first render it impure by touching it to an actual source of impurity, and only after that immerse it. And we discussed the Mishnah's case, asking who cut this tube. If we say a chaver cut it, why do I need immersion? The chaver prepared it with the strictest adherence to the halachas of purity. Rather, it must be that an am haaretz cut it. A common person, right? One who is not meticulous about the laws of purity. But in that case, would Rabbi Yehoshua say that he should first render it impure and only then immerse it? Isn't it already impure due to the handling of the am haaretz? Why would you need to render it impure? We'll come to that. And in response to this question, Rabba Bar Shaila said that Rav Matana said that Shmuel said. Actually, the case is that a chaver cut it, and the reason it requires immersion, is because the sages were concerned that the spittle of an am haaretz might have touched it. And the Gemara asks, when did this hypothetical spittle fall on the tube? If we say it was before he cut the tube, in that case it is not yet a vessel, and therefore cannot contract ritual impurity at that stage. Rather, it must have sprayed onto the vessel after he completed it. But at that point, since he is a chaver, he is careful about it, and he would ensure that no spittle would fall on it. So there's no danger that it might have become impure. And the Gemara responds, actually, we must explain that the spittle fell before he cut it, and the sages were concerned that perhaps at the moment when he cut the tube, so that it was a finished vessel, there was some spittle from an am haaretz that would render it impure, still lying on it, still moist, and so at the moment that it became a finished vessel, it was already in contact with a source of impurity. That's how it became impure, and that's why we're going to immerse it, to guarantee that it is in a state of purity before we use it to transport the ashes of the red heifer, which require the absolute highest levels of guaranteed purity. Now, the Gemara continues. Granted, according to Rabbi Yehoshua, it is found that there is an act of recognition performed in opposition to the Sadducees in order to demonstrate that the sages do not take their opinions into account. This is why they render it impure on purpose, right? This It's not a coincidence here that the case we're talking about is about the ashes of the red heifer. So the Sadducees, right, as we've discussed many times, there's this group of people who opposed the opinions of the sages and the whole oral tradition. They held only by the written Torah, which I don't know, where they got the idea of what tefillin is, because it's not written in the Torah. We only know what tefillin is like and what matzah is like from the oral tradition and many other laws. But at any rate, they held only by the written tradition. So, with regard to anything that was immersed, it would not become pure until nightfall, because that's how it's spelled out in the Torah. But the sages said, in certain situations, like here, this preemptive immersion, you don't need to wait till nightfall. You can immerse, and then you can use it even to transport the ashes of the red heifer. To show that the sages and the nation does not hold by the rulings of the Sadducees, they would intentionally render the vessels that were going to transport the ashes of the red heifer impure, and then immerse, and then use them to transport the ashes of the red heifer, as a public statement that we do not hold by the rulings of the Sadducees. As we learned in a Mishna, Para 3:7, they would render impure the priest who burns the red heifer in order to counter the opinion of the Sadducees, who used to say the ritual of the red heifer was to be performed by those who had experienced sunset after their immersion. They waited till nightfall. The Sadducee opinion was that all those people involved in the preparation of the red heifer must be completely pure, having undergone immersion, as well as having waited until after sunset when the purification takes full effect. The sages, however, maintain that the red heifer may be prepared by people immediately after immersion without waiting for sunset, in order to clearly demonstrate their rejection of the Sadducee opinion on this and all things. They would deliberately defile the people involved with preparing the red heifer and then immerse them. It is for this reason as well that Rabbi Yehoshua ruled that the tube must be rendered impure before it is immersed. Imagine what a threat the Sadducees were to Rabbinic Judaism, that they needed to make this public statement of rejecting their views by actually purposely rendering impure the people and vessels used in the preparation of the red heifer, to make this public statement that the Sadducees were wrong. And, according to the way the Pharisees, right, the rabbis, interpret the law, the immersion is needed, but not the waiting until nightfall. Why were the Sadducees so dangerous? Because they were sort of saying, the sages, we don't need the sages. Forget the sages. We, the Sadducees, know better, and the nation should just listen to us. So it wasn't just about, Torah rulings and what is the will of God. It was saying that this group, whose scholarship was very suspect, would take over and be the power, right? And we've seen, like, especially when we were in Tractate Yoma, the laws of Yom Kippur, that they would make a priest is not, could be a Sadducee, could be a Pharisee, or a follower of the Sadducees, a follower of the Pharisees. They made the priest swear that they were not followers of these tzaddukim, these Sadducees, before they could serve. Even a high priest had to swear that he was not beholden to the Sadducees before acting as high priest on Yom Kippur. Okay. But according to Rabbi Eliezer, granted, if you say that generally the setting of the sun is required after a vessel is completed, it is found that there is some act of recognition in opposition to the Sadducees anyway, as according to him, the tube used for the ashes of the red heifer, which should normally have required the setting of the sun, is used without waiting for sunset. But if you say that generally the setting of the sun is not required to remove the impurity caused by the touch of an Am Haaretz, as opposed to corpse tumah, and immersion alone is sufficient, so what act of recognition in opposition to the Sadducees is there? It must be, therefore, that Rabbi Eliezer requires the setting of the sun for purification from the impurity imparted by an Am Haaretz. Therefore, the Mishnah, which implies that immersion alone is sufficient, does not accord with Rabbi Eliezer's opinion. Rav said, Indeed, Rabbi Eliezer does not require the setting of the sun for vessels that have been completed in purity, but there is nevertheless a demonstrative sign that the opinion of the Sadducees is rejected, as they treated the tube with severity as though it had been rendered impure by contact with a dead creeping animal, a sheretz. Therefore, in not requiring the setting of the sun, they made it noticeable that they, Rabbi Eliezer and the other Tanaim, the other sages of the Mishnah, were in opposition to the Sadducees, and that the sacrificial rites, the avodah of the priest, the worship of the priest, would all be conducted according to the views of the Pharisees and not the Sadducees. So the Gemara raises a difficulty. However, if that is so, that the tube is treated as if defiled by a creeping animal, it should not, we're on the B side of 23, and this is a much shorter side of the page. It should not render a person impure, as something defiled by a creeping animal is impure to the first degree of ritual impurity, which cannot impart ritual impurity to people. Why then is it taught in a baraisa, the one who cuts and immerses the tube for the red heifer, the ashes of the red heifer, requires immersion himself, which shows that the tube does defile people, but rather say that they treated it as something made impure by contact with a corpse terumah. For such objects do defile people as well. And the Gemara asks, if that is so, the tube should also require the sprinkling of the water of purification on the 3rd and 7th days of its purification, like all things defiled by a corpse. Why then is it taught in a baraisa, the one who cuts and immerses it requires immersion, which indicates that immersion for the tube, yes, this is required, but sprinkling of the 3rd and the 7th days, no. Rather, you must say that they treated it as something made impure by contact with a corpse that is already in its 7th day, after its sprinklings, when it is still impure and imparts impurity to those who touch it, but requires only immersion and no further sprinkling. And the Gemara asks, but isn't it taught in a baraisa? The sages never made any innovations in the laws of impurity with regard to the red heifer procedure. In other words, although the sages added stringencies to the red heifer procedure, they never created new laws for it that do not exist elsewhere in the areas of halacha. We have said that this tube we've been talking about, right? Imagine like a bamboo tube that they're going to seal off one end, pour in ashes of the red heifer, then seal the other end and use that to transport it, right? So like a jar, basically made a jar. Okay, but what they're saying now is that the stringencies they added to the red heifer procedure, they never innovated a brand new stringency that didn't already exist in other areas of law of ritual impurity. And the Gemara answers, Abaye said, when they said that the sages did not make innovations, they were not referring to something of this nature, but meant that the sages did not say that a spade upon which a zav sits can become impure as a seat, right? The man with gonorrhea, if he sits on something, so then he imparts a strong level of impurity to that thing that he sat on, like this chair or this bed. And then if something else comes into contact with the chair or the bed, they become impure, right, with the sitting of a zav as opposed to the treading of a zav, the walking of a zav. And that is spelled out in the written Torah. They thereby preserved the basic, so they said, but if he sits on a spade, a tool, then it does not become impure. It becomes impure with the touching of a zav, but not the sitting of a zav. And the sitting of a zav imparts a higher, stronger level of impurity than the touching of the zav. How do we know that? As it is written in the Torah, and he who sits on any object whereon the zav sits shall wash his clothes and bathe himself in water and be unclean until the evening. Leviticus 15:6. Now one might have thought that if a zav turned over a vessel that's used to measure a quantity of water and he sat on it, or he turned over a vessel used to measure even a smaller quantity of water and he sat on it, that the vessel should be rendered impure as a seat upon which a zav sat. In other words, the sitting of Azav renders a chair or a bed with this high level of impurity. But if he turned over an oil barrel and sat on that, yes, so then it would receive the impurity of the touching of Azav, but not the sitting of Azav, because that is not something normally used for sitting on. If he happened to sit on it, it's like he just touched it. It's not like he sat on it, because it's not an object made for sitting. The Baraisa concludes, therefore the verse states, and he who sits on any object whereon the Zav sits, and be unclean until the evening. And the wording of the verse indicates that it is speaking of an object that is designated for sitting, i.e. upon which people generally sit, excluding such a vessel for which we would say to someone sitting on it, stand up so we can do our work. A spade and a measuring bowl, then, are not subject to the impurity of the seat of a Zav, even if a Zav sat on them. Rather, they are considered to be on the lower level of impurity, transmitted through simple contact with the Zav. And the same law was applied to the vessels used in preparation of the red heifer. The sages did not add stringency and decree that a vessel not generally used for sitting should be considered as the seat of a Zav. And that is where we end today. All right, let me see if we have questions or comments. On Chagigah, page 23. Are there any questions? They're not being transmitted to me. Okay, I see that there is a debate going on in the comments. I can't really catch up reading it so quick. Now, did Nina pass me over some questions? No questions, but I was cooking, so I need to check. All right, so we're both looking. I see Bill said, the heart of the Sadducee problem is found in a great quote from my tradition that I love so much I got a needlepoint of it to hang over my writing desk. The desire to rule is the mother of heresies. I mean, isn't that great quote, Bill? And I was listening this morning, I guess we'll just relate to current events for a moment, about what's going on with Putin. Like, what is Putin thinking when he invades Ukraine and is just trying to take over an entire country? And Ukraine is not a small country. We may not often think of Ukraine in our daily lives. I think about it more than most because I've been to Ukraine twice, and I hope to go back for Rosh Hashanah. I hope there's peace in Ukraine by then. But it's a big country, and Putin thought he could just roll in and take over and there wouldn't be much trouble. And I think all he was thinking about was what would be the opposition of the Ukrainian army against the huge and well-funded Russian army. And what he wasn't counting on was the Ukrainian people who love freedom and don't want their country taken over by this tyrannical despot. So now Putin has found himself in a situation, much, much bigger challenge than he ever expected. His soldiers are bogged down. That 40-mile convoy is not going anywhere. They're tossing missiles, but Ukraine is not folding at all, at least so far. And some people are speculating, how could Putin have made such a mistake? Well, because he's had absolute power for so long, surrounded probably only by yes men who value their necks, and say, yeah, that's a good idea, sir. That's a good idea, sir. That's a good idea, sir, which is, where tyranny always ends up. So they lose touch with the sort of people on the ground and what's really going on. And so, Bill's quote right here, right? The desire, what is it? Desire to rule is the mother of heresies. Now, we see on the plus side, the sages are, we have to interpret God's law and be strictly adherent to what God wills for us in the Torah. On the other hand, we have to be careful about, how is that going to actually work when we put these decrees over a population that includes both the very pious Chavarim and the uneducated Amei Haaretz. And we don't want to alienate the common people, and that they should feel they're not welcome in the temple. And they're really thinking it through. Whereas, a tyrannical leader or the power-grabbing Sadducees 2,000 years ago would just think about, well, how can I interpret the law to get the result that I want, which preserves my power, right? So that's a very good quote, Bill. Thank you for sharing that. All right, now let me see if Nina has pulled any questions for me. Charles Shapiro, I thought the red heifer was rare, mega rare. There were only 9 red heifers in all of Jewish history. But, and then the ashes would last, for decades, centuries. But eventually they ran out of the ashes of the red heifer used to purify people from corpse terumah so that they could enter the temple. And then, the population would await a red heifer. And from time to time, now in modern times, people say, try to identify a pure red cow. Right? It's kind of rust-colored, kind of a reddish brown. But it's like they never really find one. It always develops a blemish. It isn't pure red. But people say that if a red heifer was found, right? Because it's not a red calf, it's a red heifer, right? So if Mashiach comes and the Messiah comes, right? So God is going to build the third temple, not people. So it's going to go up fast, like in one day. And the Kohanim, the priests, are going to be called to serve in the temple so we can start fulfilling these obligations that we couldn't fulfill for 2 millennia as soon as that temple goes up. But we're all considered to be impure with corpse terumah. We don't even know where graves are buried. They haven't all been marked for thousands of years. The assumption has to be that we're all, not on purpose, but we've all become impure even with corpse terumah. So we would have to be purified from corpse terumah. Well, that would require a red heifer, right? And God could make a red heifer just blink into existence. But some people say, well, no, the red heifer would have already been around. So if they find the red cow, it would indicate that maybe the Messiah is about to come and the third temple is about to spring up. Okay, my friends, that's what I've got for us today. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow night, Motzi Shabbos. I actually have a meeting tomorrow night. So I'm going to try to start class pretty soon after Shabbos ends here in California by 7. I think I'm aiming for 7 p.m. tomorrow night. And it's a very short daf, actually, the next page, 24. So we should get through it, relatively quickly, even if we start at 7 p.m. So have a great rest of your Rosh Chodesh, the last of these 2 days celebrating the beginning of the month of Adar Beis that contains Purim. And you should have such a sweet and refreshing and enlivening and musical and just uplifting Shabbos. Good Shabbos.